Welcome. Sorry for our lateness. It took them a few minutes to get our espresso just right. I believe they were able to do it. This event began with an invitation to host Mr. Hitchens and Mr. Wilson on our campus, and given that my apologetics class meets on Thursday evenings, they should be here in the front. Yeah, there you go. It's the most noise you've made all semester. I thought to myself, what a great opportunity for the class, and then I thought, why not open this up to others who might be interested? So we're glad you're here. Welcome to my Introduction to Apologetics class. Welcome to Westminster, or if you're fans of Mr. Hitchens, welcome to the Poison Factory. This is where we poison minds. There will be information available at the booth out here for those interested in Westminster and possibility of taking classes here. Also, another announcement, the bookstore will be selling the book in the lobby for $10 immediately following the discussion here, and will also be open immediately following the debate if you want to purchase other books. We will have a book signing after our discussion is over. Just a few words of introduction before we begin. Christopher Hitchens was born in England and educated at Oxford, where he read philosophy, politics, and economics. We had a lively political discussion on the way here. Happy to report we didn't agree on anything. In 1981, he immigrated to the United States and was officially made a citizen in 2007. Mr. Hitchens is a journalist and the author of several books, including God is Not Great, Letters to a Young Contrarian, and Why Orwell Matters. He regularly writes for the Atlantic Monthly and Slate. From 1982 to 2002, he wrote a column called The Minority Report for The Nation. He was named one of the top 100 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy and Britain's Prospect. In case you're wondering what a public intellectual is, Hitchens has this to say about that. He says, what then are the uses of the term public intellectual? It assists us in defining someone who makes his or her living through the battle of ideas. If the age-old adage that one should steer clear of both religion and politics is true, then Christopher Hitchens is the embodiment of its counterpoint. A few years ago, Hitchens was called by George Galloway a, quote, drink-sodden ex-Trotskyist popinjay, to which Hitchens, in typical humor and wit, quickly replied, only some of which is true. He's been called, quote, an intellectual willing to show his teeth in the cause for righteousness, America's foremost rhetorical pugilist, and one of the most prolific as well as brilliant journalists of our time. In his book, God is Not Great, Hitchens, in his typical roundabout way, that's meant to be humorous, says the following. He says, Augustine was a self-centered fantasist and an earth-centered ignoramus. He was guiltily convinced that God cared about his trivial theft from some unimportant pear trees, and quite persuaded by an analogous solipsism that the sun revolved around the earth. Later on, he also notes, quoting him here, I have probably sat up later and longer with religious friends than with any other kind. These friends often irritate me by saying that I am a, quote, seeker, unquote, which I am not. He says, I know enough about all religions to know that I would always be an infidel at all times and in all places, but my particular atheism is a Protestant atheism. When my father died and was buried in a chapel overlooking Portsmouth, I gave the address from the pulpit and selected as my text a verse from the epistle of Saul of Tarsus. Quote, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. unquote. Hitchens continues, I chose this because of its haunting and elusive character, which will be with me at the last hour, and for its essentially secular injunction, and because it's shone out from the wasteland of rant and complaint and nonsense and bullying which surrounds it. As I write these words and as you read them, Hitchens says, people of faith are in their different ways planning your and my destruction and the destruction of all the hard-won human attainments that I have touched upon. And then he concludes, religion poisons everything. Douglas Wilson is a senior fellow of theology at New St. Andrews. He received a bachelor's degree in classical studies and MA in philosophy, all at the University of Idaho. He has taught high school Latin, Greek, and classical literature at Logos School. At other colleges, he has taught ethics and logic. Mr. Wilson has been the pastor of Christ Church Moscow for more than 30 years. He also sits on the governing boards of Logos School Moscow and the Association of Classical and Christian Schools. Doug is the author of The Case for Classical Christian Education, Reforming Marriage, Heaven Misplaced, Letter from a Christian Citizen, which is a major national response to the recent bestseller of atheist Sam Harris. His other works on theology include Mother Kirk, Reformed is Not Enough, and To a Thousand Generations. He has also written A Serrated Edge, a brief defense of biblical satire in Trinitarian skylarking, and several children's books. He's the editor of Credenda Agenda magazine. Doug and his wife Nancy have 3 grown children and many grandchildren, all of whom live in Moscow. It's impossible, as I soon discovered, to pick out Wilson's wittiest commentaries. They are much too numerous. We could be here all evening. So to give you a flavor, I take a portion of Wilson's recent review of a book entitled The Shack, which is sweeping the evangelical landscape today. First, Wilson's commendation. The book, he says, is filled with numerous insights into what makes people tick, and those insights are wise, shrewd, pastoral, tender, and they deal with sins at the root. Unquote. There are, however, problems, so Wilson continues, and this brings me to the way in which this book was simply terrible, blasphemous. But before going on, I have to hasten to add that it is a peculiar form of evangelical blasphemy, one that is well-intentioned and naive. He says, I remember one time I was at a conference where the group I was with was sharing the venue with another group. So one time I sat in on the chapel services of that other group, and they began singing Spring Up, Oh Well, which was fine with me. But since the song involved water, somebody had developed hand motions and jumpy up and down motions. So there was this room full of adult Christians jumping up and down while they were singing Splish Splashing Along. But then they got to a verse where it was all about the blood of Christ instead of water, and they continued right on with the hand motions and the jumping, and the only thing missing was the rubber ducky. And then he concludes, nobody blasphemes like an evangelical can. One of the things you may note about tonight's speakers is that they have much in common with respect to their understanding of religion generally and of Christianity in particular. Both men agree that religion can pose serious problems to our understanding of truth. Both men agree that at least certain aspects of Christianity in particular can be a roadblock rather than a conduit to truth. Mr. Hitchens, of course, sees the problem as the entire set of religions. Mr. Wilson sees the truth of the Christian religion as the only way to deal with its false permutations. The reason we are here, however, is not because of what Mr. Hitchens and Mr. Wilson have in common. Rather, we are here because what Mr. Hitchens and Mr. Wilson do not have in common is so foundational and decisive that it determines and directs everything else that they claim to believe and to be. For Mr. Hitchens, God is not great. For Mr. Wilson, God is so great that even an argument against him depends on that greatness. The format of our discussion tonight will be this. We will first have a presentation from Mr. Wilson, followed by one from Mr. Hitchens. We will then have a response first from Mr. Wilson, then from Mr. Hitchens. We will then have closing statements from each, after which time we will invite questions from the audience. Now, what I'd like to do is ensure that we have a balanced array of questions, so I'll ask if you have a question for Mr. Hitchens, you stand on this aisle at that microphone. This is the Hitchens aisle. And over here is the Wilson aisle. If you have a question for Mr. Wilson, stand over there, and we'll try to alternate back and forth as much as we're able to do that. I will moderate those questions, and those of you in my apologetics class will know that I have not much tolerance for effusive commentary, so it could be that many of you are better debaters than anyone up here, but this won't be your time to show that. So what I'd like to do is limit commentary to some extent and ask you to please address questions to the speakers. After our discussion and debate is over, both Mr. Hitchens and Mr. Wilson will be on stage to sign their books. Again, they'll be on sale out there if you'd like one. I would ask you to line up here. We'll move the table back and to come across this way and exit there so that we can do that in an orderly way and so that they can at least have some breathing room. So without further ado, we are honored to have both of our guests with us tonight, Mr. Doug Wilson, Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Please welcome them.
Well, thank you all. It is a great honor for me to be here. I've visited this campus once just to walk through and take a look, and that was a pleasure and honor, but it's a very great honor to address you all, speak to you. And I want to thank Christopher for being such a good sport on this little tour that we're doing from New York to Philly to D.C. tomorrow. We've had a grand old time thus far, and I'm very grateful for the whole thing. In the introduction, it said that Christopher read philosophy at Oxford. I tried to read philosophy at the University of Idaho, and I remember one time sitting in the library reading aloud just to maintain forward motion. In one out of the classes, the various classes that I've taught or instructed at Logos School and New St. Andrews, one of the things I've done, one of the classes I've taught is classical rhetoric, and at New St. Andrews. And one of the things that they teach you in classical rhetoric is that persuasion is not just argumentation and reason, the logos, but it's also pathos, an emotive appeal, and ethos, your situation, your character, and what you can do to persuade an audience that you're for real. And so one of the things I wanted to do to establish my ethos at the beginning is And you will know, if I feel like I'm starting to lose the debate, I will put this on. Of course, one of the things that we've been talking about, and each element of this triad will come up probably every time Christopher and I talk. It did in New York, and it will probably certainly do so tonight, and then on to D.C., is the ancient triad of truth, goodness, and beauty. Truth, goodness, and beauty. One of the things I wanted to focus on this evening was beauty, but not because the other two things are irrelevant, and those certainly can come up in the questions or in our exchanges. But the way I want to argue, the way I want to talk about this, is that the Bible and God is not something that I'm interested in reasoning my way to. I don't believe that Christopher and I could find common ground, agree upon the rules of historical investigation, or agree upon the laws of logic, and then reason our way to God. There are many Christian apologists who believe that is possible to do. I don't reject evidences, but I'm not an evidentialist. I believe that evidences have their place in apologetics, but I don't believe that they should be foundational. What I'm interested in doing is asking about the preconditions for any sort of statement. So in a debate, I think it's necessary to do two things for those who are observing the debate. What is necessary to do is not only look at what the person is saying, what argument is coming out of him, what is he articulating, but also take a look at his feet. What is he standing on in order to make that sort of statement? In other words, I would like to invite you to ask not only to hear what Christopher says about what he believes about the nature of the world, but then ask yourself, well, if he's correct and the world really is that way, would he be able to make that statement? Right? Does any sort of statement follow that's rationally coherent from his assumption of the way the world is? Put simply, if the universe is time and chance acting on matter, if the universe, if the cosmos is simply matter in motion, then everything I think, feel, respond to is also matter in motion. If the universe, if the cosmos is matter in motion, then this table is matter in motion, and what's going on in my head is matter in motion.
With luck.
What's that?
With any luck.
With any luck, yes. Quite. Now, if you have the illustration I've used before, and I will continue to use it until I see or hear a satisfactory response. If we were to take 2 bottles of pop, Mountain Dew, Dr. Pepper, and shake them up and put them on the table here, and they were both fizzing over, it wouldn't occur to we couldn't fill the auditorium, first off, and it wouldn't occur to anybody who happened to wander through the auditorium to ask which one of the bottles of pop was winning the debate. They are not debating, they are simply fizzing. They are simply matter in motion. That's all it is a chemical reaction. Now, if there is no God, if the universe is simply matter in motion, if the universe is simply a series of chemical reactions, and we have in our bodies a series of chemical reactions, then we have no reason for believing our thoughts to be true. And that means that we have no reason for believing that our thoughts are chemical reactions. The whole thing collapses on itself. Now that argument, I think, applies to each one of these things that I'm talking about. It applies to our reasoning capacity. If the universe is simply ultimate chaos, then why would we trust logic? If the universe is ultimate chaos, then what is the basis for morality, goodness? And of interest to me tonight, if there is no God, then how can we possibly say that anything is beautiful or lovely, objectively beautiful or lovely? You can't say anything is objectively true, you can't say anything is objectively good, and you can't say that anything is objectively beautiful. You can tell us what your preferences are, but that's what they are, only preferences. Now, in the short time that we've been doing this tour together, Christopher and I have found out that we have a number of common interests, literature and poetry among them, and the writings of P.G. Wodehouse at the right near the top. We had a good time at lunch yesterday quoting sections out of Wodehouse's work. Wodehouse was a master writer. He was a master of metaphor. He was good at it. But what does that mean in an atheistic universe? What does it mean to say someone is good at it? If someone is good at ballet, or good at painting, or good at composing concertos, why is that any different from any other concatenation of atoms going on in some other quadrant of the universe? Why do we point to one part of this this little riot of matter and say that's lovely, that's beautiful, that's good, that should be published, let it go, that should be bought by the art gallery, that should be accepted and promoted and so forth, and this over here is sentimental kitsch, this over here is no good, this over here is not worth the time of day? Well, atheists, of course, make value judgments all the time. They make moral judgments, they make truth claims, and they make aesthetic observations. Christopher is a very gifted writer. He's good at what he does. He's a craftsman. And so I'm not disputing whether or not Christopher seeks to be a good person, or seeks to be a rational person, or seeks to be a wordsmith. I know that he seeks all of those. What I'm looking for is warrant. What is the warrant for that? What is the accounting that you can give of that? Is it possible to say the universe is governed by no God, the universe is meaningless, the universe has no teleology, the universe is going nowhere, but this is lovely, this is beautiful, this is a masterwork? And I don't believe that that's possible to sustain. I don't believe you can maintain objective standards rooted outside our subjective experience in any one of these three areas, whether it's truth, goodness, or beauty. That being the case, what I'd like to do is sort of anticipate an objection and then wrap up. The anticipated objection is one that I've seen an atheist make, that this argument, since the universe is meaningless, any subset of it is meaningless, and rejected as the fallacy of division. The fallacy of division is an informal logical fallacy, not a formal structural fallacy, but an informal logical fallacy, which says that if something is true of the whole, that it must be true of the part. And so the atheist could object, just because the universe is meaningless doesn't mean that this little part of it is meaningless. Well, as an informal fallacy, sometimes informal fallacies are true. Sometimes they are accurate observations, other times they are not. So for example, if I were to say the Pacific Ocean is made up of salt water, then it follows that this bucket of water from the Pacific Ocean is also salt water. What's true of the whole is true of the part. It's a fallacy when I say that this, the Pacific Ocean taken in its entirety is heavy, therefore a thimble full of water from the Pacific Ocean must also be heavy. No, it's light. That's the fallacy of division in action. So the question is, does the meaninglessness of the universe translate down to the particulars like salt water does with the Pacific Ocean? I believe so. I believe that if there's no teleology, if there's no point, if there's no direction, then that fact haunts you down into all of your endeavors, all of your pursuits, especially concerning your aesthetic pursuits. Anyone who thinks that the history of philosophy has not had an impact on the production of art in our culture, I think is simply not paying attention. It does translate, and it has, I believe, genuinely aesthetic damaging effects. So, thank you. I'll leave it there.
Well said. My fellow Americans. It's taken me a long time to get to say that. By the way, does anyone here have the nerve to put up their hand and say they know why it's called the World Series? There's always one smart ass. You be quiet for a second. It took me 25 years. I immigrated here 27 years ago. Why do they call it the World Series? It's a game no one else plays. Maybe Dominica, perhaps Haiti, Japan. Okay, Canada, but come on, World Series? What? And it was interesting. Every American I knew said, why wouldn't it be called the World Series? It's our game. You will in a second see where I'm going with this. But I wouldn't accept it. No, there must be a reason why it's got that name. And I chased it down. The contest, the event, was sponsored by a newspaper called the New York World. Now defunct. Everything's gone about the New York World. No one remembers it, no one reads it. But the World Series survives as a kind of ghost remnant of this. It could have been called the Post Series, but I don't think Americans would have been so proud of it. I'm only saying, just to begin with, beware of solipsism. As Dr. Oliphint was so kind as to remind you, don't ever think you are the center of the world. Be very careful of assuming that you are the object of a divine design, that there's something special just about being you. That's all you have to prove. That why wouldn't a person such as yourself have God on their side? Why wouldn't it be? Of course God would care who I slept with, what I ate, what holy day I observed. Why would he not? Surely that's why the heavens are arranged in the starry beauty and array that the form they take. And then you read Hamlet's reflections with Yorick at the side of the grave, and you are forced to wonder if maybe, even though it's a less beautiful thought, it could be that the galaxies are not arranged with you in mind. Well, I've already got ahead of myself by not thanking you for having me here, and for not thanking Dr. Oliphint for his extremely warm and generous introduction. When I first published my polemic against theism, I told my publishers I didn't want the conventional New York tour. I didn't want to go to New York, Washington, Chicago, Berkeley, San Francisco, and so forth. I wanted to go to the South, and I wanted to go to colleges that were devout, and I wanted to ask for a challenge wherever I went. And I have to say I've been very impressed and touched by the willingness of people to accept this challenge and to invite this abuse of hospitality into their own. And all I ask in return is that this aisle be permanently named for me. With a large plaque long after I'm gone. All right. The problem of relativism, the problem that Douglas Wilson has been assailing you with correctly, the problem of saying that really judgment is impossible, that no one value is greater than another, that sub specie aeternitatis, under the eye and scrutiny of heaven, nothing really matters. It doesn't really, who cares who wins the Second World War? Who cares whether black Americans become full citizens or not? Who minds? Why would we care? Why is that? And is it perhaps something of the aesthetic in ourselves, such as was stated by the great English Romantic poets who did take a side for humanity and for humanism, often, by the way, against theocracy and almost always against religion, when they said, beauty is truth. Truth, beauty, that is all you know and all you need to know on earth. Beautiful statement. Once you've heard it, you can't forget it. It ranks to me with another statement made by another great person of the Enlightenment a little earlier, Thomas Jefferson, who says, and once you've heard this, you won't forget it either. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. He's talking about slavery. It's a beautiful statement, there's no question about it. It also has a certain equilibrium to it. I think you'll agree. And yet, when you think about it for a moment, if there is a just God, what is the need to tremble? If there's a just God, all our concerns are trivial by comparison. Why would we weep? Why would we care? Why would we mind? A just God trumps any possible anxiety or difficulty or crisis we might have. But if there isn't a just God, and there isn't, because the heavens are empty, then you might have to abolish slavery by yourself and not require the divinity and justice of the sublime and the paradisical to do it for you. You'd have to take responsibility. It isn't beautiful to say, no, I don't want the responsibility, I will refer it upward to a supreme, unchallengeable, I would say tyrannical, because unchallengeable and unchangeable, essentially absolutist, I would go as far as to say totalitarian authority. The things that happen to us in this vale of tears will go on happening to us as they did to our predecessors and as they will to our descendants when we are dust. And these things cannot be avoided, and they cannot be referred upwards and outwards to a dictatorial view. Let me give you an example. Let me give you a couple of examples. I wrote a book about the Parthenon. I think most objective people would say it's the most beautiful temple of the ancient world, perhaps the most beautiful temple ever built by human hands. Its extraordinary symmetry and harmony makes it quite different from the other temples that claim to conquer death, because the conquest of death is the first thing the barbarian wants to claim, and all barbarian monarchies want to claim. That's why the pyramids are built, to show that death has no power, we'll outlive it. That's why Babylon was built, that's why Karnak was built. All the great temples of the ancient world, when I visit them, strike me with horror. They're built by slaves. Their building is commissioned by slave owners. It's so obvious that they're built to impress, to oppress, to dominate, to grind people down. The Parthenon is lightness and everybody, and it's a new departure. And though there are terrible things about it, I'll mention some. The cult of Pallas Athena, a fictitious goddess. The Eleusinian mysteries, hocus pocus sprung on the peasantry by Greek priests. The sculpture on the frieze probably shows human sacrifice. We can't be certain of it, but it looks very likely that human sacrifice was going on there. Even though Keats wrote so beautifully about that procession in his own version of truth, beauty, and beauty being truth. But I think the cultural project is this, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, friends. It's this, the cultural project. Can we rescue, can we separate the beauty, symmetry, harmony, and civilization of pre-Christian, pre-monotheistic, pagan, polytheistic Greece? Can we keep what if that is valuable and useful, and philosophical, and poetic and dramatic, while dumping the supernatural, the superstitious, the cultish, and of course the Athenian genocidal imperialists that sent expeditions to destroy the whole populations of islands and neighboring republics with which it disagreed, or which refused to pay tribute? Yes, I believe it is possible. I believe it is possible in the same sense as I know it's true that even as Verdi wrote his Requiem, he didn't believe in God. He didn't need to believe in God to produce that beautiful music. It isn't true that secularism can't produce a cathedral or an opera. It is true, however, that a secular civilization will have to keep what is valuable of the beauty and symmetry of religious art and devotional architecture, while rejecting the supernatural and the superstitious. You see, the supernatural and the superstitious are not the same as the numinous and the transcendent. I don't come before you, atheist and materialist as I am, as someone who simply says that Douglas Wilson and I are two competing bottles of Dr. Pepper. Nor do I come before you as someone who says I was created out of dust, or as the Quran would say, out of a clot of blood, that I'm an abject serf, that I'm a piece of nothingness fashioned out of garbage by a capricious, tyrannical God. That's even a worse insult. I'd rather be Dr. Pepper than that, I have to tell you.
Me too.
But now let's contrast the numinous and the transcendent to the superstitious and the supernatural. Francis Collins, my new friend, Christian believer, C.S. Lewis fan, commissioner of the Human Genome Project, great physician, great scientist, great humanitarian. He says, he's a pantheist in effect, I think. He goes on a long hike into the mountains, and he comes at one point, I think it's in your home state of Washington, I may be wrong, but I think it's in the Pacific Northwest. He comes on his hike to a point where there's a triune waterfall, a 3-in-1 waterfall falling, and yet arrested in its fall because it's frozen. It's a frozen water trinity. Anyone who understands harmony, symmetry, the beauty of nature will understand what Dr. Collins is seeing. He says, in his own account, he says, at that point when seeing it, I fell to my knees and I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. Some of you may have had similar experiences, I don't know. I'm immune to this kind of thing, but I'm not indifferent to it. Where does he get off with such a non sequitur? It is, of course, very beautiful to see a 3-fingered frozen waterfall. What if it had been 4 fingers and not a trinity? Would he not have accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior? Did you see the slack-jawed, gaping propaganda of the World Trade Center when everything was all cleared away? At the bottom of the girders, there was a cross standing there. All buildings are built with a crosshatch of steel. It's well known. They go like this, like all windows. It would be amazing if there wasn't a cross there. If it was a star and crescent made out of melted steel, I'd be really impressed. And so would the people who blew up the building and want you all to die. If it had been a Star of David, okay, I'd have been slightly impressed too. Only very slightly, for my mother's sake. Now, let's be serious. This stuff is not true, and it's not beautiful, and it's not symmetrical. It is superstition. It is the way the mind searches for form and will find it if it's looking for it, and looks for symbols and looks for miracles and revelations where they're not really there, and is terribly easily satisfied by tiny little bits of pseudo-magic. But if you want to be awe-inspired, ladies and gentlemen, and let me just tell you that those of us who do not believe we are divinely created, let alone divinely supervised, are not immune to the idea of awe and beauty and the transcendent. Let me invite you to look for a moment at the pictures taken by the Hubble telescope. Some of you may have done it. If you haven't done it now, or yet, do it soon. The extraordinary revelations of swirling, yet somehow beautiful new galaxies in color and depth and majesty like nothing I think the human eye has ever seen. Turn away from that if you wish and gaze at a burning bush in an illiterate desert part of the Middle East and say that that's where revelation comes from. I don't believe you'll be able to do it. Or read a page of Stephen Hawking on the absolute magnificence and consistency and underlying beauty. As Einstein says, the great miracle of physics is there are no miracles. It all carries on, holding together all the time. There are no interruptions in its order. There are no suspensions of it just to please Joshua or just to please some sect or tribe or group. No, it's much, much, much more impressive than that. I know I've talked for a little too long, but I'm going to do this if it kills me. Hawking has a colleague who looked at the event horizon of the black hole. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know what a black hole is, at any rate. If you could travel towards a black hole, not yet possible to do, if you could, in theory, the event horizon is the point at which the black hole is pulling everything into itself. So over into the black hole goes light itself. It's so strong it can pull light back into itself. It's really awe-inspiring. A lot more, say, than a crowd of pigs infested by devils running down a hill into the sea, which is a piece of sorcery and cheap magic of the sort that shouldn't impress any thinking person. Think about a black hole instead. Pulling the light into itself, the event horizon just reorganizing nature. So that if you could get to that lip, the lip of that event horizon, and fall in and go in, you could, in theory, see the past and the future stretching before and in front of you. You would see time, except you wouldn't have the time to do it, of course, if you were a mere primate, as we are. But Hawking has a colleague who says if he knew he was dying of a terminal illness, that's how he'd want to go out, is over the lip of the event horizon. That would be majesty. That would be magnificence. That would be awe-inspiring. That would be apocalyptic. So it's in the natural world, it's in the world of science and the world of innovation and discovery and doubt. We wouldn't have discovered any of these things if we'd taken the religious story for granted to begin with. We would have said we already know enough. We know. God made this. God wants it this way. What's the need for inquiring? We already have all the information we need. The big difference between this side of the house, mine, and the other, is this. I am absolutely certain that I do not know, but that it might be possible to find out, and that doubt and skepticism and innovation and inquiry are the only means by which wonder and beauty and awe and symmetry will be discovered, and beyond those peaks we can yet see, new, more wonderful peaks will rise. Whereas, on the Wilson side of the house, it is said, we already have the certainty. We know that God created us, and we even claim to know his mind and what he wants of us. And I just invite you to open your minds to the possibility that the skeptical and the inquiring and the doubtful will be better than anything that calls itself faith. Because anything that calls itself faith calls itself certainty. And for certainty, I think there is no place in an institute of intellectual mentation and higher education. And I'm very grateful to you all for giving me the chance to say so. Thank you.
All right. I believe the drill was to interact for a little bit and then closing statements. I would like to make a couple of quick observations and then ask a few questions. The observation would be, Christopher and I were talking this morning about whether I believed in the miracle of the Gadarene swine that he referred to, and I certainly do. I accept all the miracles of the Bible as described in the Bible. But I mentioned to him the Gadarene swine rule, which is just because a group is in formation, it doesn't mean they know where they're going. The other thing that I would like to point out about that is that it's not an either-or thing. It's not as though by believing that Jesus did a miracle with the Gadarene swine, that I'm thereby prohibited from believing that there are marvels to be seen through the Hubble telescope. It's not, I'm not forced to choose one or the other. I believe that marvels occur on the grand cosmic scale, and marvels occur at levels much smaller than what occurred with the Gadarene swine. So just God is a macrocosmic God, and God is a microcosmic God. He speaks in the great things, and he speaks in the little things. The difficulty here, one other thing about this, when you think about crossing over the event horizon into a black hole, and you get to the point where you see the future and the past at the same time, or you think about quantum mechanics and things traveling like a particle and arriving like a wave, or vice versa, or the same thing, you know, they're both at the same time, that sort of thing. The thing that astonishes me when I read physicists, particularly atheistic fellows who are evoking a sense of wonder out of their descriptions of these sorts of things, and you heard Christopher just do it, they then turn around and say that they have objections to the doctrine of the Holy Trinity because they can't make sense of it. Does it make sense to you that you could see the past and the future at the same time, provided you were headed toward a big black hole of nothing? Would you sketch that for me on the blackboard, please? Oh, of course.
That could be done. The Trinity can't be done in that way.
Ah, sure. I'd triangle and a circle. So the point.
Have it your way.
Now, the point is that there are mysteries beyond us, right? The issue is not whether there are things in the universe that will stagger us and make us go, whoa. The issue is when you reflect on what you think is actually going on, when you reflect on what is actually going on, and you say there's no purpose in this, there's no design behind it, it's just a plain, weird, crazy place, I believe that you have removed the aesthetic element. You've removed the element of intention. It may be big, it may be crazy, it may be wild, it may be chaotic, but it's not lovely. But if it is designed by God, in other words, if all those galaxies that you can see through the Hubble pictures, if all those galaxies, if the Crab Nebula and all of those things were put there on purpose by the triune God of Scripture, then you have not only something that's grand and big in scope, but you have intentionality. You have what I would call artistry. God is a great artist. Now here's the difficulty. When Christopher early in his, and this will lead up to my question. Yes. When you began with why would he care? Why would God care? Why should I take a solipsistic approach and assume that God would care who I slept with? Well, if I said why would he care who I, and then I drew a blank, it's not just, it cannot, you could fill it in with more than who I slept with or who I lusted after in my heart. You could fill it in with who I killed, whose family's village I destroyed, whose nation I blew up because I felt like it, whose nation and tribe I enslaved because it just seemed like the thing to do at the time. Christopher said, when we discover that we are not accountable, that we have no court of appeals that goes up to the top with this totalitarian God as Christopher sees him, I see a father, he sees Big Brother, what it boils down to. So I see a loving father, and he sees the eternal surveillance cameras and that kind of thing. And he says, well, if there's no...
And thought crime.
Thought crime, right. And you have... exactly so. So you have you said if there is no God there, we might have to abolish slavery by ourselves, right? And here's my question. Why wouldn't you say we would have to abolish slavery ourselves or not?
Well, indeed, the or not is always pregnant there, just as in your remarks just now about how God might care about more than just who you slept with. I was picking a trivial example. Or, by the way, in what position you did so, or on what holy day. You wanted to make it more...
Or he killed them afterwards.
You wanted to make it more serious and said, what about who I kill? Well, as no one here doesn't know, there are biblical mandates for killing, and indeed for the killing of nations, and for the killing of tribal groups, and for the killing of all their children so that their name be blotted out, and for, in the case of some luckier groups than the Amalekites, keeping only their young women alive, so that, I think for purposes better imagined than described, so that there is a divine mandate for killing. You can be told what to do, and religion is obedience to the divine law. It isn't to say you would behave as an ordinarily moral person would expect to behave with a divine warrant to do so. No. As any Mormon will tell you, if the head of his church tells him to commit a murder, he has to assume that the head of that church knows better than he does, that it might be for a much higher reason.
But why are we having this?
He would do something that no morally sane person would do because he was religious. Now, let us not lose sight of this point, which you have, in our previous discussions, several times conceded. If God wanted you to do it, you wouldn't ask the ordinary moral questions. And we know that there are biblical warrants for slavery and for genocide. And so your point that, that religion conforms to ordinarily understood humanitarianism simply falls. That's the first thing.
So my question is this, because I don't see us really disagreeing at this point. I believe that it was okay to kill Amalekites, right? Because it was not okay to not do it because God told them to kill the Amalekites. We would differ on...
Well, there you are. I got you to say it. Okay.
Well, happy to say it, and didn't get me to say it.
No, I know you get a bang out of saying it.
What I actually get a bang out of is what I'm going to get you to say next. And that is, neither one of us has a problem with killing Amalekites. I don't have a problem with it because God told him to do it. You don't have a problem with it because the universe just doesn't care what happens to Amalekites.
No, actually, that's not true, because what if I was an Amalekite?
Well, you're not the universe.
Well, no, I'm sorry, it still changes everything.
No, it doesn't. Because you're not an Amalekite. They're all dead. They're all dead.
That is what relativism means. You know, don't you, that it actually is true. There are discussions among Israeli rabbis, including Israeli rabbis in the Israeli army, published in Israeli newspapers today, say, is the commandment to kill the Amalekites applicable to the Palestinian Arabs, Christian and Muslim, or not? Is Amalek still with us? Is he the name of our enemy? Are we still enjoined by God to destroy all non-Jews in the greater Palestine? This stuff goes on.
And if they answer it in the affirmative, you don't mind.
This is why I feel justified in the subtitle of my book, that to no argument does religion add anything that doesn't make it more toxic. Now, we wandered a little from the symmetrical and the beautiful point, didn't we? But perhaps the Gadarene. I did have something, because you challenged me on the Gadarene factor. Yes. If you believe in all these miracles, it's entirely up to you. There are some miracles I wish were true. The first one is the best. Changing water into wine for a wedding works for me, and also shows, I think, a concession by Judeo-Christianity to the influence of Hellenism in the region, which was still quite strong. As you know, the Passover Seder consists really of people lying around on couches, drinking wine, asking questions dialectically in a Socratic manner, bringing the children into the discussion and so forth. That's an admirable tradition on which to base things. And I think not enough of Judaism, and certainly not enough of Christianity, is based on that method. But at least the miracle of Cana shows they knew the importance of wine, and they knew they wouldn't sell their religion without that. But the Gadarene swine worries me. There may be a woman who's possessed by demons and devils. I don't think such a thing could possibly happen. I don't think women are, or anyone is, demonically or diabolically possessed. The Prophet Muhammad believes that our world is surrounded by demons and jinns, that they're around us all the time. Devils are in the dust. Devils are in the dust, are in the air and the wind. Some very primitive animist tribes believe this too. No decent thinking person can believe it. And even if it was to be the case that a woman was possessed by a demon, you can't make the demon go away by making it go and infect a group of pigs in order to make them commit suicide. I mean, in other words, that miracle, if it were true, wouldn't be worth having. It would be a claim that your prophet was a vulgar sorcerer, or was at least trying to impress his followers with vulgar witchcraft and sorcery. I leave that point to you, but to say that's either true or beautiful seems to me to blaspheme both terms quite badly.
The difficulty with taking the miracle that way, the fellow involved was named Legion. It was a guy, not a lady. And the pigs were an unclean animal for the Jews. And when Jesus cast the demons out, if you think of it in terms of a simple wonder worker who's out there stupefying the peasants, and you take it as a petty miracle that way, that whoa, he killed the pigs, then of course I think you've got a point. The miracle is tawdry and overdone if that's all you understand it to be. But the story ends. It's quite striking with the people in that village couldn't keep this guy bound. He lived in the tombs, and when Jesus cast the demons out of him and the pigs were killed, the people begged Jesus to leave that region. They preferred the devil they knew to the devil they didn't know. I think there's a commentary being made on the state of the spiritual health and spiritual vibrancy in Israel at that time. They didn't want Jesus there messing with the arrangements that they had made, with the accommodations they had made. So if you simply assume
with
that...
their demon-haunted world.
Correct. In other words, Jesus was... What Jesus did was he traveled around casting out demons, and what many people don't realize is that demonism, shamanism, this sort of thing that you encounter still in many parts of the world, that sort of thing was banished, exiled, defeated, and overcome precisely by the Christian faith. If you're encountering witch doctors and people who are living in bondage to that kind of thing, whether it's made up as you believe, or genuine as I believe, or what is more likely, a mixture of both. I believe that there's a great deal of superstition mingled in with genuine spiritual problems. If you believe that, then you say, let's look at the scoreboard. Let's look at what has happened, where the Christian faith has gone. We have been instrumental as Christians in lifting the clouds of superstition. What you glory in, the Enlightenment, I don't think was possible in witchcraft-riddled societies. I think it was dependent on the Christian faith.
Okay. It's my turn to ask a question, isn't it? I think.
Yes.
I'm going to stay on this point too. But by way of preface, Senator John McCain has just nominated as his running mate a woman who attends a church in which spiritual warfare and anti-demon tactics are regularly discussed, has been filmed having hands laid on her by what I would describe as an animist bishop from Kenya. She may describe as a Christian, who talks about the witches he's expelled from his own area of the highlands of Kenya. So how can you say that Christianity has rid us of the nonsensical idea of witchcraft, demonism, and exorcism? To the contrary, it's the reason why these nonsensical, barbaric, primitive ideas survive. Now, I hope I don't take advantage of you if I tell the audience, with your permission,
sure.
of a question I asked you yesterday and the answer you gave me. I asked Douglas Wilson this. Suppose that a soul, I'll call it a soul for his sake, a person is born in Saudi Arabia today into the Wahhabi theocratic society. Would you rather that person became an atheist or joined the majority religion of that state? You want to tell them your answer?
Oh, I'd prefer you become an atheist.
Yeah. And I thought it was a very honourable reply on your part, and I want to press it a little bit. Do you believe that Thomas Aquinas, called a saint by the Roman Catholic Church, levitated and flew all around the nave of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
I'm afraid you lost me. I'm a good Protestant.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't believe it either. in other words.
Yeah.
You don't think that's true? Do you think? Do you think that Muhammad took a night journey on a horse from the Arabian Peninsula to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and the horse left a hoofprint before rocketing him up to paradise?
I'm not with that one
I
either.
don't think so.
No.
Either. So here's my question: how can you manage to say that miracles are only true when they're Calvinist? Because it's always seemed to me, as a secularist, never mind an atheist, that either all religions' supernatural claims must be true, or none of them are, my own position, or only one of them is. The least probable position of all.
Right.
The one you've decided to occupy. Why is it that the miracle claims are okay made by Calvinists and not by Muslims, other kinds of Christian or Jews?
Notice the structure of your argument. The structure of your argument is that...
Glad you think it's got a structure.
Well, it does, and here it is. The structure of your argument is that you're reasoning from the existence of counterfeits to a denial of the genuine article. I believe that there are plenty of spurious Federal Reserve notes printed up by counterfeiters in their basement. And I believe that this assertion that this bogus Thomas Aquinas $20 bill and bogus Islamic flying horse $20 bill does not obligate me in the slightest to deny the existence of genuine currency. I don't see how you can argue from the existence of counterfeits and fakes and knockoffs to a denial of the genuine.
But I wasn't doing so.
You were asking me...
No, I was asking how on what you found. Your assertion that yours is the only true bill.
The ones I believe in, the ones I believe in are the ones I believe in.
Yes. For example, I've spent a lot of time on a small point that I think is a big one. You probably, or some of you will know of the existence of a text called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It was originally fabricated by Christian Russian Orthodox fascists in the pay of the Tsar to try and condemn the Jewish people for a blood libel and a secret government based on conspiracy, and it's now the chief paranoid document on the website of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and it's had a huge circulation in Christian and Muslim religious circles for a very long time. It's usually described as a forgery. If you've ever read about it, you'll have heard of it as a forgery.
Yeah.
And it may seem to you a pedantic point, but I don't think it is. Whenever I write about it, I say, don't call it a forgery. Why not? A forgery is a copy of a true document. Protocols of the Elders of Zion is not a copy of a true document.
Right.
It is a fabrication. It's a whole cloth hoax. It's a criminal slander invented out of whole cloth. There's nothing forged about it at all. There's no true bill to begin with. Now do you see the distinction?
Yes.
Well, why are your miracles the true bill and the others are all copies of it?
Because they happened. Jesus really did.
Right.
Jesus really did rise from the dead, which I believe on the same basis.
Aquinas believed that.
Sure.
Muhammad believes
the fact
some
that
of that.
Aquinas didn't fly around Notre Dame does not mean that he got everything wrong.
No.
Right. So, I believe that I was not there at the Battle of Waterloo. Didn't see it happen. I accept it on the basis of eyewitness accounts and authorities' eyewitness accounts that I deem to be reliable. I do the same thing with George Washington crossing the Delaware. I do the same thing with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, I believe that you could generate a whole host of evangelical Protestant miracles that I don't believe in either. I believe that we ought to study it, love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, love the Lord our God with all our brains. We should look at the evidence and make a determination. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's a miracle, it's good, and it serves the cause of the gospel, or it helps keep people in line or helps inspire them. If it's not true, if it didn't happen, we should have nothing to do with it. And I've been in Christian circles for many years, and I've heard all kinds of miracle stories that I don't believe. I've heard probably more miracle stories that I don't believe than miracle stories I do believe. But as a Christian, I don't believe that I can go into the Bible and pick and choose. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then we of all men are most to be pitied. And so it doesn't matter how socially good it is or bad from your point of view. What matters is the truth. And so when I say I believe this miracle occurred, it has nothing to do with, I don't accept Hume's argument as an absolute, that you can just rule miracles out. I believe on the basis of well-attested miracles with eyewitnesses you believe, that's the most rational thing you can do.
I was about to stop and say no further questions, but it's not fair to the great Scotsman to say that Hume said all miracles could be ruled out. He simply said you have to ask yourself, if you appear to see the laws of nature being suspended in front of your eyes, which is more likely, that they've been suspended in your favor, or that you are under a misapprehension?
Right, and
Otherwise, you're not allowed to appoint your own senses, your own impressions, as the arbiter of the natural order, and that might lead in the end to a dismissal, but it isn't an a priori one.
Sure, and I believe that Joseph, when he found out that Mary, his betrothed, was pregnant, he followed David Hume's advice to the letter. He didn't know what the most reasonable explanation was, and that sort of thing. It's not that in the ancient world, it's not that people didn't know where babies came from. It's not that they didn't know that you couldn't walk on water. It's not that they didn't know that you couldn't change water to wine. They knew that as well as we do.
No, all Joseph knew was who hadn't made her pregnant.
Right.
If we have to be crude about this.
Correct.
And if you were David Hume, you would ask which is more likely, that the fact that he hasn't made her pregnant and she is the result of divine intervention, or that a Jewish girl could tell a fib?
Sure. And Joseph.
Now, of the two, I don't think the latter is overwhelmingly improbable.
Sure. And Joseph was
And
right
since
with
there's
David
no
Hume.
religion has ever been founded except with the claim that its founder and prophet was born of a virgin. I have the whole list in the front of my book, if anyone. By the way, available at fine bookstores everywhere. I have in the first 2 pages of my book a list. There is no religion from Aztec to Hindu, including Buddhism, where the Gautama is born through a slit in his mother's side, where it doesn't begin with a miraculous birth.
And there's no counterfeit money.
You couldn't be in the religion business without claiming that, especially in the Greater Jerusalem area.
And you couldn't be in the counterfeiting business without green paper and numbers in the corner.
The Quran absolutely attests it. The Quran attests the virginity and motherhood of Mary.
Sure.
It's in the Quran. What could be wrong with that?
Nobody counterfeits brown Safeway shopping bags. They're not worthwhile. It's not worth it to counterfeit them. If something's worthwhile, all right, if you've got a genuine article, then you've got counterfeits.
Okay, now, pretty soon we're going to have to see if we've exhausted the tolerance of our brothers and sisters. But you know what? You remind me of something. Douglas and I had lunch yesterday with Marvin Olasky. Probably some of you know him. He's now the president of the King's College in New York, and was once famed as the head of President Bush's faith-based initiative. Dr. Olasky and I have something in common. We both used to be members of Marxist organizations, and we were chatting a bit about our old allegiances. Now, I remember I.F. Stone saying about Mussolini calling himself a socialist and Hitler calling himself a national socialist. He said, that's a compliment of a kind. Said my old comrade, Red comrade, as he said, nobody bothers to counterfeit bad currency. Well, it turns out that they do.
But not currency believed to be.
It turns out that the ironies of history and the cruelties that reality practice on us as a suffering species. Yes, actually, people will go to great lengths to say, I'd like to deal in this bankrupt currency. It can happen, and it has, as you've just shown.
Yes, people do.
Well, we don't have a chairman, do we? So when do we know when to invite our guests to join us?
When do we know?
I would forego mine for the sake of questioner, if you would.
I'm happy to.
No one will think I've said too little, will they? That I've dodged the responsibility.
You can tell who's in charge here. And it's not me.
My dear chap.
We are happy to have questions now. Mr. Hitchens would like this aisle named for him. I just wanted to mention there is a way to do that. It will cost you.
The endowment trap.
This will be
The old endowment trap.
This will be the Hitchens aisle. for questions. This will be the Wilson aisle for questions. Please move to the microphones if you'd like. And we'll begin to entertain questions, after which time, if you have a book, we'll line up over here for, you can sign that, or they'll be for sale out in the lobby. You might have time to come up.
Not just a book, a receipt, please.
A receipt, right.
Thank you. They say a book stolen is a book sold, but I'm not having that.
Yes, on the Hitchens aisle.
Sir.
I have two quick questions, if that's all right.
Please.
One and a follow-up. You mentioned that the idea of conception of God who drives demons from pigs makes him vulgar, and you said that that seems to blaspheme God one way or another. Does that mean that you have an implicit understanding of theology, in that if God were to exist, he ought not to look like this?
No, I wasn't being anthropomorphic, and I may have spoken too swiftly, but what I said was not that it made God a blasphemable person, but that such an action, getting infected people to transfer their demons to infect pigs to commit suicide, was neither true, in my judgment, or beautiful by any standard. It's blasphemed against both the standards, if you wish, the aesthetic qualities that we were discussing this evening. Not that it blasphemed against God, it blasphemed against truth and beauty both.
All right, one more.
Sorry if I didn't put that plainly enough.
No, by all means.
Quick follow-up.
Okay, quick follow-up. How do you mentioned probability between a miracle and a natural event. How do you go about assigning probability to a miracle?
By that means that, especially if it's reported to me by someone who is bringing it to me second or third hand, I think I have a duty to doubt that the operations of nature were suspended. Say that an astrological child finder called into MSNBC to say that she knew where the kidnapped kid was being held. If I don't think all my antennae tell me that that's not true, that she would have no means of doing that. It's much, much more likely. By the way, this is the first time I introduce even the idea of fraud, even the possibility that someone would self-interestedly perform or claim to perform a miracle. I didn't do that before. It is claimed that the laws of nature were suspended, that the sun stopped at midday to give Joshua time to finish his battle. I don't think that happened. Okay? I think the likelihood that it happened, as opposed to the likelihood that people were under the misapprehension under a hot sun that it had happened, is overwhelmingly in my favor as a skeptic. And I don't think I could improve in that sense on what Hume said. Douglas thinks that the sun did stop in the sky, so that the revolutions of the planetary motions, the things that hold the universe in place, that keep the water on the planet, that keep the moon moving around, that was all stopped for Joshua's sake. I ask you, which is more likely?
Thank you.
Yes, over here. Mr. Wilson.
I'd like to extend Mr. Hitchens' line of questioning to you, Mr. Wilson, and to ask you, as he was asking you how you know that the miracles of Christianity are true and other miracles are not. And I was wondering if you would please elaborate on what you were saying. You said that you believed they were true because you believed them to be true. You said you believed that they were true because you believed that they happened. But I was wondering if you could give more of your epistemology, more of your reasons for discerning what is true and what is not.
I'm sorry if I created the wrong impression there. I was not urging fideism, that they were true because I believed them to be true, or that I was just going to take a blind leap and affirm the truth of them. Basically, my epistemology of miracles, if you want to put it that way, goes to the resurrection of Christ as the cornerstone. Because I believe that Jesus came back from the dead, as the scriptures foretold that he would, after 3 days in the grave, and rose again from the dead, because that was an event that was predicted by the scriptures, but which the disciples did not anticipate, and it flummoxed them. And Jesus told them overtly what was going to happen in the narratives, but they didn't expect it, didn't believe it, they weren't out at the gravesite 3 days later waiting expectantly, checking their watches. They had to be talked into it. Some of them, it took more time. With Thomas, with others, they wouldn't accept the word of those close to them. They were persuaded over time of this. And I'm convinced that the transformation in the disciples from the sheep that were scattered when the shepherd was struck, from Peter, who denied the Lord repeatedly, to that same Peter a few weeks later courageously preaching the gospel on the day of Pentecost. I believe that transformation and the consistent witness that the apostles and the early Christians gave of Christ coming back from the dead is the central miracle. That's the thing that I think is the cornerstone. Now, if I accept that, and I don't believe I can be a Christian with an Orthodox Christian without accepting that. If I accept that, I don't understand scrupling at the other things that these same people tell me that Jesus did as anticipatory miracles and so forth. I do believe, and this is where Christopher and I agree, I do believe that Jesus ought not to be understood as a petty wonder worker, snake handler type of guy going through small villages wowing everybody. I believe that Jesus said a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. I believe that Orthodox Christianity invites skepticism about miracles. I believe that that's actually a healthy skepticism, and I believe that even Christopher's version, skeptical version, is a dose of that I think big quadrants of the Christian church could profit from, instead of just telling stories to gullible fellow believers. But once you accept the miracle of the resurrection, I believe that all the other biblical miracles follow and fall into place. That's my basic epistemology of miracles. It's evident to me from the historical documents that the disciples and apostles really believed and lived like they believed that Jesus actually came back from the dead.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I...
Go ahead.
I don't feel I can just let that totally go. There are two things. One on miracles themselves, and then the resurrection. It was argued by some of the early church fathers, Marcion, I think, was the best known, that Christianity should begin again, that it should be a religion of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And it shouldn't be the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. It shouldn't take on the appalling burden of all the mad, genocidal, Stone Age Jewish books that preceded it. It could begin again. Unfortunately, Marcion lost this argument, so Christianity takes on this appalling burden with which it saddled itself forever, which is the reason why it will never become a universal or redemptive religion, among many other reasons. However, if you want to think about miracles, it's very simple. Moses and Aaron have a contest with the magicians and conjurers and miracle workers of the Pharaoh, another man who believes that he can survive death. And his magicians and conjurers and miracle workers produce many, many, many miracles. It is said that Aaron outdoes them, and that with Aaron's rod, in the end, they're beaten. They lose. But it makes a very simple point. The ability to produce a miracle says absolutely nothing about the truth of a religion. And that is biblically attested. It is biblically attested that people whose religion is false can produce miracles. Mm-hmm. Do I need to say it another way? Bear it in mind. As to the resurrection, I'll only add this, as an amateur on these matters. There are a huge number of resurrections mentioned in the New Testament. Just in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, there's the raising of Lazarus and of the daughter of Jairus, neither of whom ever say a word. Nothing is ever said about what was it like, what did they say, how was it to be dead? Questions that you'd think even the most incurious villager would want to ask them. They're just raised from the dead and we move on. There's nothing said about it. I think rather astonishing, but making it seem as if resurrection is a relative commonplace in this area. Then, in the Gospel of, I'm pretty sure it's Matthew, and I know I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, at the time of the crucifixion, I almost can quote the verse directly, the graves of Jerusalem opened as the heavens darkened, and as the veil was torn. And those who were lying in those graves left them and walked around the markets and streets of Jerusalem and were greeted by many who they knew. What's wrong with this story? It means resurrection is a relative commonplace. It means there isn't anything specifically wonderful about it. It means the sort of thing you might expect any time, to meet a former dead friend or relative of yours wandering the streets in their cerements and grave clothes. Final point is this. If someone is born of a virgin, it doesn't prove to me that anything they say is true. Someone may say in the middle of an argument with me, you lose. I say, why is that? Because my mother never went to bed with any man. I say, wait a minute, you haven't proved your argument is better at all by saying that. Doesn't prove you're a better person. Doesn't prove that God is your father. Doesn't prove anything. I may grant that your mother was a virgin. Parthenogenesis is actually a remote possibility, but you would prove nothing by proving it of yourself. And if you say that you win the argument because you were once dead and now you're alive, I will look at you slightly narrowly. If I was on the bus with you, it's odd, isn't it? If you were on the bus next to someone who said, you know, I used to be a dead person, but I'm alive now, you would move towards them or away? Everybody knows what they would do.
Provided they were
or if they
strangers.
said they were hearing voices from God telling them what to do. I think the reaction is the same. Taxi! Anyway, suppose that I thought, all right, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt here. You used to be dead, now you're alive. Your arguments are still no good. You still can't get a syllogism right. You still don't know about formal logic. You still have no command of the laws of evidence. So all your work is still ahead of you, even if you think that these nonsensical fairy tales do have any basis in fact. So I grant the whole thing, and it makes no difference to me. Wouldn't make me a Christian if it was all true.
The stranger on the
Nor,
bus.
and it shouldn't make you one either, unless you are a completely credulous person.
The stranger on the bus is a stranger on the bus. However, if you traveled around with a guy for 3 years, he told you he's going to come back from the dead, and he did. I hope you would look at him more than just squinty-eyed. You know, golly.
But
come on.
there was no witness to that.
The other thing is,
There are no eyewitnesses. There never were.
We're
None of
postulating-
them could read. None of them could write.
No,
None of them could read the Old Testament.
Christopher.
None of them could read the New Testament because it hadn't been written.
You're
Come on.
overstepping it.
Yeah, there are too many eggs in the pudding.
No, the French say he lies like an eyewitness. It's a term of French jurisprudence.
Here's the problem. The whole point you made about resurrection was the same sort of thing as forgery and fabrication. Lazarus was a resuscitation. Lazarus died again. Jesus was raised from the dead, never to die again. The resuscitations that Jesus accomplished and that Peter did and happened in the Old Testament, resuscitations occurred, yes. But Jesus was the first person in history to come back from the dead, never to die again.
And to say he would reappear in the lifetime of his disciples.
No.
Yes.
No, he said he was going to come back and destroy Jerusalem, which he did in 70 AD, right on the money.
It was the Roman Empire didn't do this.
No, he said this generation will not pass away till all these things are fulfilled.
Oh.
The sun, the moon. Hang on a second. This is really important, actually.
I know it is, yeah.
Yeah. When Jesus says in Matthew 24, the sun's going to go out and the stars fall from the heavens, he's quoting from Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 34. There's decreation language throughout the Old Testament. Every time it occurs in the Old Testament, it always refers to a military destruction of a nation or a city-state, always. In Isaiah 13, an oracle against the king of Babylon, and then you have the same decreation language. Then Jesus says in Matthew 24, not one stone's going to be left on another. The disciples say, when it's going to happen? Jesus quotes Isaiah. So Jesus is not talking about the end of the space-time universe. He simply isn't. Has nothing whatever to do with that. It has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened within one generation, just as Jesus said, authenticating him as a prophet.
Don't you have an abnormally unsuspicious mind? If you see someone saying, I'm saying this so the prophecies can be fulfilled, he knows what the prophecies are. And he says, the prophecies say, if the Redeemer comes to Jerusalem, he'll come riding a donkey. Where's my donkey? Let me straddle the donkey and come in, and it's Passover time.
Sure,
and it says in the books themselves, it says, and this was done so that the prophecies might be fulfilled. So it's a self-conscious engineering of what would be laughable to call predictive.
I'll give you the donkey. The donkey could have been arranged. What I was talking about...
Donkeys can always be arranged.
I was talking about the
Asses can be arranged.
I was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was not arranged that way. So when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem, the central point is you interpreted him as predicting the end of the space-time continuum. He wasn't talking about that at all. He was predicting the end of the Judaic Aeon, the temple sacrifices, and Jerusalem, and he did not arrange for the Romans to come in and do that.
He sure did not, but...
We have other questions.
Okay.
I think I found the title for book 2. I'll give you the donkey. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'll go
Not
ahead.
bad?
Granted the ass.
First of all,
Okay, bring it on.
first of all, I'd just like to thank you for making yourself available for questions.
Oh, please.
And my first question
pleasure.
is if I can ask you a question based primarily on yours and Mr. Wilson's discussion in the book.
Yes?
My question is, based on the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, I ask, how do you explain suicidal people who act under the golden rule? We have several examples of this in recent shootings by my fellow teenage Americans. Robert Hawkins, the 19-year-old gunman in this last year's Ahama mall shooting, said in a conversation with a friend before his attack that, and pardon my language, but I think it adds depth to this, his life was a piece of shit. What's to keep him from treating others like their lives are pieces of shit? What is your basis for what I ought to want done to me?
Yes.
Just to both?
This is to Mr. Hitchens.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, he was in the Hitchens Memorial Aisle, after all. I already knew he was mine.
After the money. After the money.
I'm one of those who, I'm willing to argue about the golden rule till the cows come home for a reason I'll disclose in a moment, but I'm also one who thinks it's a greatly overrated rule, and you've actually helped me very much to explain to the audience why that's so. First off is this. When people say without Christianity we'd have no morality, we wouldn't know what was right, what was wrong, I do point out that the idea that you should love your neighbor, not as yourself necessarily, because that's rather strenuous. In fact, it's extreme and it's impossible and rather sinister. But love them, at least to the extent of not doing anything to them you wouldn't want done to yourself, is certainly in the Analects of Confucius as a thought, a very long time before monotheism, and is undoubtedly and is best known as the golden rule from Rabbi Hillel, the Babylonian rabbi, who when asked could he express the whole of Talmudic wisdom in one sentence while standing on one foot, said, yes, he could. Do not do to another what would be repulsive if done to you. All else is commentary. Now, what's wrong with it? Some people need to be treated harshly, obviously. It's the same problem that you have in the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament it says, if an eye must be repaid with an eye, a tooth for a tooth, you know how it goes. It comes at the end of that crazy chapter about ox goring, and the same chapter that says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It's one of the most appallingly ranting lex talionis, sadomasochistic chapters of the whole New Testament. But at least it says, let people be treated really cruelly if they have transgressed against you. In the New Testament, it says something even more nonsensical. You can't, unless you're with yourself without sin, be casting any stones. On that basis, we can't indict Charles Manson unless we are innocent ourselves. This is moral chaos. A lot of people need to be treated by me in ways I don't want to be treated myself.
Like the
Otherwise, there's no basis for law. There's no basis for justice. So the whole of biblical religious morality is based on a very unsound tautology. And I guess that's the whole of my answer. And it shows that law must be derived by us from human and social experience and from the knowledge that we will gain by the study of the psychology and other things of the criminal type, and cannot be sucked down by us from a heavenly decree. That's the only way you can't get law. That's the only way you can't get morals, is by assuming that they will be given to you from on high.
This is why Christopher and I agree on the troublesome Amalekite question. Some people need to be treated harshly. Right?
Thank you.
Unless he's an Amalekite. Yes, we'll finish with questions at 8:30, just so you can plan your night in the Wilson aisle.
This question is applicable to both of you, but I'm going to direct it to you first, Mr. Wilson. It's pretty obvious from your discussion tonight that you two don't agree. So you mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Wilson, about common ground. My question for you would be, do you see common ground between the two of you? Or in other words, what is it that allows you to have a discussion like this, that allows you to both articulate your positions? Because at least from where I'm standing, it looks like your positions are not reconcilable at all, and that this type of dialogue would be impossible. So if you both could just comment on the nature of common ground, and if that factors at all into your discussion, that would be great.
Yes, I can answer that very quickly and very, very directly. I don't believe the common ground between us has to do with our worldviews or what we think. I don't think we have common ground there, period. Christopher's an atheist, and I'm a Christian minister, so we don't have common ground there. And when I tell you what I believe the common ground is, and I believe it's substantive, wide, and deep, very profound common ground, our disagreement will extend to that. Christopher won't agree with me on that being the common ground, but it is. He's created in the image of God, as am I, and as are you. That's our common ground.
You better hope that what you're looking at here, that's me, isn't God's image looking back at you. You've every reason to hope that's not true.
Yes, there was.
As for the more he
there
says,
was a fall.
The
Yes.
more we find common. The more we find. As for the more we find common ground, the more I'll deny it. Look, I wrote a book once called "Letters to a Young Contrarian," and old guy, came up to me in Los Angeles at a bookstore the other day with a copy of it and said, "Would I sign it?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "I tried to give it to my son," said this old guy, "in the hope that he'd become a contrarian, but he refused." There is a gulf fixed, as it says in Scripture, a gulf fixed between not just what Douglas Wilson thinks and what I think, but in how we think. We just don't think the same way. It's not, we don't disagree on details,
right,
or on matters of fact or so on, or even interpretation. We just don't think the same way. It would be completely impossible to make compatible or reconcile our methods of thinking. I attribute my presence here among you to the operations of the laws of biology and random mutation and natural selection. I have no reason to think that I'm any different from everybody else in that respect. I don't think that you're here for that reason and I'm here because of a divine plan. I can't make myself think it. I don't think it would be a good thing if I could make myself think it. It's as simple as that. And I'm very glad that there's no reason to believe that there is a supernatural guidance and authority, because, as I said to you earlier, if there was one, it would be able to convict me of thought crime, and it would be an unanswerable, unchallengeable totalitarian dictatorship. So to me, it's a huge pleasure to realize that the evidence for this is non-existent.
Okay. A random mutated question from the Hitchens aisle.
Thank you both for being here. I think you started touching on what I was going to ask. But my question was that if there is a loving God, what could he do, or what would he have to do for you to believe that he existed and to get to know him?
Well, if there was a loving God, I can't but feel that one would know it. We wouldn't, I mean, in other words, a thing that's always baffled me about not just Christians of various kinds, but Jews and Muslims, is they keep asking God, why? Why do you let this happen? Why do you permit all this appalling suffering? Why do children die of cancer in the womb? You can fill it all in for yourself. I've always thought that's ridiculous. I mean, if I believed in God, I would have enough respect for the idea of an omniscient, ineffable, omnicompetent, omnipotent, omnipresent deity, not to be pestering him with demands for an explanation of himself. It would be enough, surely, that there was this. Not that it was some equal that you could be having a bullying match with, like the book of Job, where God descends to pettiness and spite and revenge and makes himself look ridiculous. You wouldn't do that, I'd say. The explanation wouldn't be available to me. My brain wouldn't be big enough to understand it. My consciousness wouldn't. But the reason why I say that is because it's pretty self-evident that if there is a deity, he is not a loving and compassionate and tender one who wishes all the best for us all the time. A loving and compassionate and tender one who wishes all the best for us all the time. If that was so, our lives would be banal, they'd be empty, they'd be pointless, they'd have no meaning, we'd have no reason for an independence of mind, we'd have no reason for inquiry or free will, we'd have no reason to relish the struggle for innovation by anxiety and doubt, and so all of that would be, it would be a warm bath. It'd be like being a Buddhist. It'd be a warm bath of semi-consciousness and benignity. Thank goodness it's not true.
He almost said, "Thank God."
Yes, thank goodness it's not true. So
That close.
in other words, I suppose this is as far as I take it. When I talked about dictatorship before, I would say of it, if it was celestial, what I would say about it if it was human and merely terrestrial, that it would be even worse if it came to me under the excuse of being benign. The worst kind of patronizing tyrannical authority is the one that says it's controlling you for your own good. Right?
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, given your statement at the very beginning of this debate that you recognize evidences as being useful, but you are not, in fact, an evidentialist, given your response to Mr. Hitchens, to why you believe citing evidences, given your answer to my fellow student Matthew, given to why you believe certain things, answering with evidences, how do you claim to not be an evidentialist when thus far we have heard no mention of a divine revelation? And do you have, and how do you understand the noetic effects of a relationship with Christ?
Great question. What I was attempting to answer there was my belief in particular miracles, particular historical details, and that has to do with the infallibility of Scripture, which I accept, the full infallibility of Scripture, and I accept all the miracles, and I accept all the miracles because of the resurrection of Christ. The broader question, do I believe in that God reveals his existence to us through Scriptures and through the general creation? Yes, I do. So I don't need a miracle. I don't need a miracle, a special miracle, in order to believe in God or to believe in his triune character. God's eternal majesty and power have been clearly shown, Paul says in Romans 1, through the things that have been made. So general revelation is sufficient to declare the power and majesty of the divine Godhead. And I believe, number one, it's not just that God does that toward us, but it's not just that he gives us light, but he gives us eyes. So I believe our capacity to know that God is there is built in. And this ties in with the noetic effects of sin on our thought processes. Again, in Romans 1, Paul says that men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Though the things that are known about God are clearly evidenced, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's the noetic effect of sin. So I believe that one of the things that we have to keep in mind, and this goes back to Christopher's answer to the previous question, and that is when we look at wars and turmoil and stress and strife in the world, we can't just say there's God who's holy and infinite and good, and man who's innocent and never did anything wrong, and why are these terrible things happening? We have to take sin into account, not only for the state the world is in, but for the way, as a way of explaining why we respond to those events the way that we do. So I believe that evidences are important and they can be plugged into the discussion, but I presuppose the triune God of Scripture declared in creation and in Scripture and begin there.
No, I won't. I would just think, that's what I assume faith must be, is the willingness to assume what you have to prove. And to come before an educated audience and say, it's true because it's in the Bible. And I believe in the Bible because it's true. I used to hear when I was a kid, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I don't think that's evidence. I don't think that's argument. But if it's faith, I suppose that's what it must be. But you just assumed and asserted what you were asked to prove.
Sure, I have faith in the Bible.
I can't have escaped your attention, can I, ladies and gentlemen?
You have faith in reason. And
No, I don't. No, I absolutely do not have faith in reason.
You don't?
No.
Well, very good.
I try and sharpen my practice of reason, doubt, skepticism the weighing of argument against evidence and of evidence against interest. In other words, I'm more inclined to doubt something if its truth would be something that would suit me. One of the moral superiorities of atheism, by the way, is we don't particularly want it to be true that we shall be annihilated when we die, that there's nothing to hope for from the heavens, that the heavens are empty. We don't necessarily love that idea, but we're willing to face it since the evidence for the contrary appears to be trivial or non-existent. We don't indulge in wish thinking, and we don't assert as true what we've just been asked to prove. I have to say, I think that's a methodological difference worth observing in an institution of higher education.
Tell me again why you don't believe in reason.
Because reason is by definition not something that is a matter of faith.
It's axiomatic.
No, it's a
kind of like the Bible.
It's a process.
No, I begin with the Bible. You begin with reason. I have faith in the Bible. You have faith in reason.
You think
and if I ask you to justify,
you're a man of one book.
And you're a man of one thought, all right? So what you
if you laugh at that, you laugh. I think we'd probably be like Bill Maher's audience. You'd laugh at anything. No, to say that you believe in the process of reason, inquiry, skepticism, and the measurement of evidence against interest, so that you would doubt most of all something that favored your own conclusion. You'd subject that to more scrutiny. You call that one thought? You have contempt for thought if you think that. I'm sorry. I have to not stop trying to be funny here.
No, hang on a second. If you have contempt for thought, simply because you recognize that someone who bases everything on reason has faith in the reasoning process, what's wrong with saying that? Why can't you say, I have confidence in reason, I have faith in reason, I trust in the reasoning process? You won't say that because it will reveal that both our positions are faith positions. If you ask me why I believe in the Bible and I flip open the Bible and show you a verse, you say you're appealing to what you need to prove. If I ask you, why do you believe in reason, and give me a reason,
I'll tell you
then
what,
you open your book,
no,
you open the reason, and you give me a reason.
No, you're making a huge leap. I say that the Bible, like the Quran and like the Torah, is man-made, not God-made. It's a human-made literary accretion full of plagiarism, contradiction, fragmentation, and so on. It's like every other book ever written.
And I wrote
there is nothing divine about it, and the appeal to it saying, I can trump anything you say because here's God's word on the page, is a contemptible way of arguing.
I wrote a logic textbook. Does that make logic man-made?
Logic is man-made, yes. Yeah.
So there's no reason to follow it then?
No.
If I reject the Bible because it's man-made.
Logic is the attempt by humans to make sense. It isn't a divine endowment that we possess. Same with philosophy. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. We don't say it's the revelation by... You say what you have is revealed. Now, here's the way of clarifying the difference between us, somebody asked earlier. I don't claim to know more than I can. Everything I've said this evening, I've backed by assertions, evidence, argument. Douglas Wilson, who's just as modest and friendly and tender a chap as I am, says, yeah, but I have an advantage over Christopher, because I know what God wants, and I know what he says in his book. I have access to a higher authority. Now, what I want you, I'll ask him, but I don't care. I've asked him before. You have to ask him. How does he know that? And by what right does he claim to know the mind of God? And if you were a serious spiritual person, wouldn't you think it was a bit much that someone said they could come before you and tell you what God wanted? As long as they don't call it modesty, I don't mind. As long as they don't call it humility, I don't mind. But I don't like being told that my arguments aren't as good as his because he has divine information that's withheld from me. Yes, sir.
I think we're over here. Thank you.
You used physics extensively in your opening statement. How do you answer Hume's problem of induction? And as perhaps to anticipate a possible answer, if you take the Kantian route and say that causality is a precondition for experience, how then do you rationally justify your belief that your future experience will be uniform and cause and effect like your past experience was?
Well, I don't think it's an improbable or unfair projection that would be the case.
But that's begging the question.
Well, yes, but and I'm not a physicist either.
But
I mean, look, there's an assumption with which I will dispense. Okay, before the inquiry begins, I'll just tell you what it is. There is no supernatural intervention in this argument. Okay, it's not going to be resolved that way. It's not going to be referred upwards to the celestial dictator. That's not the way these. For example, maybe the greatest of the early physicists, Laplace, when he shows his working model of the system to the emperor. And here at last, you're looking at the solar system from the outside as an orrery, not from the inside, looking at externally as a model. And the emperor says, well, Mr. Laplace, there's no God in this extraordinary revolution of these bodies. Slightly irregular though it is, because it is slightly irregular, showing it's not been designed. And he says, well, Your Majesty, it just happens to work without that assumption. It does. Now, Laplace has in common with Douglas Wilson a great thing. He was a complete determinist. He thought that everything that was ever going to happen had already, in a sense, taken place, that it was predetermined. But I don't think it's necessary to believe that, to realize that the system, wobbly, imperfect, and half-baked as it is, operates perfectly well as we observe it, leaves nothing else to be explained without the assumption of any divine intervention.
Laplace's system without determinism is no system. It doesn't work at all.
It's an orrery. It shows how the planets move. Even Isaac Newton, who was prey to every kind of superstition, he noticed that the planets wobble a bit, that their orbits are not quite perfect. And he said, well, it must be that God every now and then intervenes to put them back on course, because he couldn't have designed the thing to wobble like that. Because pretty soon things will start to fly out of orbit, which indeed they will, because as we know, our system is doomed, as is our sun. We may think we have something now. We have a lot of nothingness coming, and we can read it in the skies. The physics has already told us that it's going to be all over. Some designer, by the way, and some design. And as I meant to say to the lady earlier, who said it was a loving God, maybe loving, but only intermittently so. Maybe loving, but only some of the time. Is also very incompetent, very absent-minded, sometimes very capricious, and sometimes very cruel. And you know what? As a father myself, I can tell you, as you can be all those things at once. So why do we make mysteries when none exist? That's my closing question.
We'll allow one more question over here, and then we'll have to conclude. We hear you.
There is a tremendous contempt by modern atheistic liberals for religion. The irony is that since the beginning of civilization, there has been religion and religious symbolism. The alternative we have is between an uncentered concatenation of atoms and a centered individual before coram Deo, before a holy God. Certainly more compelling. I ask you, Mr. Wilson, to say something and comment here at the end about the stark contrast between a centered purposefulness and a concatenation, an Epicurean concatenation of atoms that Mr. Hitchens seems to support.
Yes. Can I take that as an invitation for each of us to make a closing statement?
Yes, you may.
All right. Good. And I'll just key off of that. I believe that goes to the heart of the matter. What kind of universe is this? What's going on in it? And can my postulating that this is what's going on give an account of what I'm currently doing in explaining that? If I believe that if the universe is simply an infinite billiard table with all the atoms and just banging around, and that's all the universe is a concourse of atoms banging around, jostling their way through history, how can I get from that to an articulate explanation of how it got there? And this is true, as I said at the beginning, of truth, goodness, and beauty. If I walk into the kitchen and I see a puddle of milk on the floor, and I want to know what happened, and I start asking questions, I don't ask the milk. The milk doesn't know. It's the accident. All right? Now, if the universe, if the cosmos is simply an accident, then why ask it or any subset of it what's going on? It doesn't know. It's the accident. Christopher earlier said that he wanted to position himself somewhere between my fizzing bottles of pop, just the mindless chemical reaction, and the purposive, created in the image of God, desire for truth, goodness, and beauty, and so forth. He wanted to position himself somewhere between those. But my question is why? Given what you say the universe is, given what you say the cosmos is, give me the syllogism, give me the reasoning process that shows how meaning can arise from non-meaning. Ovid, in his book The Metamorphoses, describes how there was chaos at the beginning, and then one day the gods sprang out of chaos. Well, I believe that that's what's happening in the atheistic worldview. They're saying there's chaos, and then one day a miracle happens. One day you have intelligence, design, self-reflection, knowledge, logic, and so forth just spring from chaos, like Ovidian gods springing from the chaos in the ancient world. I don't believe that that can be demonstrated. I don't even think the modern, I've not encountered an atheist who even attempts to give a reckoning for it, who attempts to give an accounting for the process by which chaos gives rise to logical order, aesthetic order, or moral order. Thank you.
The questioner said that the view that the universe was full of caprice and randomness and probably didn't know we were here and may not register our departure if we should be extinguished was the view that I supported. The evident fallacy in what he said should be, I hope, clear from what I'd said before, and I'm sorry if I put it so badly, or I'm even sorry if he wasn't prepared to pay attention. I don't support this view. Pay attention. I don't support this view. It's not, I don't advocate that evolution is true and that the Big Bang took place. It's not part of my propaganda. I accept it. I think the evidence is overwhelming that that is, in fact, the case. I don't dispute it because it might be nicer to think that instead of that, there was a God who was looking out for me. I can't make myself believe something because it might be convenient to do so. Now, how difficult is this to hoist in? Let me give you some examples, some ways to think about it in closing. You compounded your mistake, sir, by saying that it was either that there was an Epicurean naturalism or there was a divinely supervised, purpose-driven cosmos, as if those were the only two alternatives. Absolutely not so. As I had already said to the lady there, assume a loving God if you will. I'll have to add on the evidence that this God may be sometimes absent-minded, sometimes capricious, sometimes incompetent, sometimes cruel. How, if you have an anthropomorphic conception of God, can you deny me the right to do this? If there's a God who you're so sure is determined to intervene in and supervise our lives. For heaven's sake, use the cranial capacity that evolution has at least given you. Now, I recommend you look at Lawrence Krauss's work. He writes a very good column every month in the Scientific American, also in the New Scientist. He's probably the greatest living physicist. He's the person who worked out something very important, which was this. Edwin Hubble was not just right that the universe is expanding with redshift light at an extraordinary rate of knots, so that very soon it won't be possible, by analyzing, even with the Hubble telescope named after him, the effects of the Big Bang any longer. They won't be visible anymore because the rate of expansion is not slowing down, as Newtonians used to think it must. It's increasing. So the Big Bang is causing everything to fly apart at a much, much faster rate. So very, very, very soon, where there was something, there will be nothing. And you only have to look into the night sky and to see the Andromeda galaxy. You can see it already. It's headed directly for ours. Some design. We can already see the appointed destroyer of our universe, and it's not from the book of Revelation. It's not from some nonsensical, raving Christian propaganda from the island of Patmos. It's just there. It's part of the way the universe is. So you have to make that fit, don't you, with your argument for a purposeful, loving, caring designer who knows that we're all here. Do it if you can. All right, I'll try one more. the designer of the National Geographic's Genome Project, you should all send in your sample and find out where your ancestors came from in Africa, has written a most extraordinary piece. They've now sequenced it all back into Africa, and they've found out where our species began in Africa in the savannah. After a climatic crisis, it's very easy to imagine now, something like a titanic volcanic explosion in Indonesia that blotted out the sun, that altered the whole climate against us. It's thought that the species went down to about 5,000. In fact, in other words, before they decided to make the migration north, find somewhere cooler, abandon the savannah for which our bodies are designed, we nearly went, we were 5,000 casualties short of going the way that 98.9% of every species ever created, ever found to be present on this earth, has already gone into extinction. I'll say it again. Effectively 99% of every species ever on earth has already become extinct, and nearly us. Some design, some father, some caring God, some designing supervisor. There is no recourse to a dictatorial authority in this. It's very lucky that we're here. The randomness in that case worked in our favor. Francis Collins, the Christian genome scientist, thinks we've been here maybe 100,000 years. Richard Dawkins thinks maybe 250,000. I'll take 100. 100,000 years. For 98,000 of those years, if you're a Christian, you have to believe heaven watched with folded arms. Most people died of climatic crises in Africa, or just watched their children die as soon as they were born, or saw them perhaps struggle for a few years. Life expectancy maybe 25. People dying of their teeth, of revolting deficiency diseases, misery, struggle, famine, turf wars over women, turf wars over territory, terror at any supernatural seeming event, an earthquake, a comet, everything a nightmare, a mystery, no germ theory of disease, fear, trembling, but slowly, gradually, struggling onward to become Homo sapiens. For 98,000 years, heaven watches that, not caring, and then says, 2,000 years ago, it's time to intervene. Why don't we give God a son and murder him cruelly in an illiterate part of the Middle East? That ought to solve it. That's what you have to believe to be a Christian. Well, I invite you to believe it. But I can't envy you. The sheer strenuousness, the unbelievable contempt for evidence, the fantastic indifference to everything that humanity has actually succeeded in finding out about itself and its cosmos and its species, that you need to keep this little cult alive. All the same, thanks for having me.
This. Thank you. Anytime.